Let me do that then, and welcome you all to this, I think, 11th LANDac International Conference on Land Governance. My name is Guus van Westen. I'm one of two chairs of LANDac, together with my colleague Gemma van der Haar. And that position gives us the pleasure of opening and also closing this conference. I mentioned it's the 11th conference in a row and the second one that we have to conduct online. Last year, we also labeled it Online Encounter, not quite ready to accept new realities of working at distance. Now, I think we are a bit more resigned to those facts, and the conference label has returned. We do intend in time, hopefully next year, to go back to an event on location, specifically because we miss the social dimension, the personal interaction that were always very interesting, very vivid in LANDac conferences. But for now, this will do. And there's also, we found a silver lining. Last year, we definitely managed to reach new audiences that were not really part of this crowd before. So it also brings some positives. Maybe in the future, we should look for some hybrid opportunities. This brings me to the overall theme of this year, land, crisis, and resilience. It builds on an initial concern for climate change, very much the topic last year, and the superimposed COVID-19 crisis. Which then also triggered an interest in crises themselves as a phenomenon, and the realization that different crises tend to intersect and also have a ripple effect on different realms of life. It may affect health as a pandemic, and then also livelihoods, which also may have their implications for natural resource management, and for conflict, and it may trigger migration, an intricate tangle of issues that all relate to each other and are set in motion by an event such as like a shock like that. Yeah. All of these are linked also to land use and differences in access to land and changes in that. Crisis, intersecting crisis seems to hit us with increasing frequency and severity. But I would also like to cautiously urge you not to focus exclusively on the problematic side of it. I mentioned how the enforced online version of this conference last year made us reach new audiences who would not normally be able to travel to the conference venue. It reminds us of the famous saying by Nietzsche, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." While not literally true, ask long COVID sufferers, crisis can open a window to change or to innovation, not just technical innovations, but also in institutional and policy terms. Without in any way downplaying the suffering caused by land crisis, climate change, and pandemics, I think we should also try to identify such glimmerings of hope, of opportunity that may result from the current conditions. Now is the moment, at least in some respects, to possibly create change. Much of this also applies to LANDac. We are now entering the final year of the current second cycle. I think the future of LANDac as such is quite sure. It's a lively network, but we too, in the next year, will have to redefine ourselves, redefine our role, adapt to changing circumstances, adapt to changing priorities. And in this, we will definitely build on the pillars that we have developed over the last decade. Among them, this conference, also the successful summer school on land governance that will follow next week, with a gradually increasing number of participants. Then there is the network of local professionals exchanging information and sharing knowledge on land governance. That's an increasingly lively community. also increasingly run from the south. And now in the fourth place, we have the knowledge management program for the Land at Scale project or program that was launched yesterday. Land at Scale is a Dutch government program that aims at just and sustainable land governance in a range of countries, envisaged are 14 countries. And LANDac is now, together with the ILC, embarking on an innovative learning and knowledge management program in support of these initiatives. With these foundations and in this network of people that are now meeting again, I see challenges, but I also see opportunities ahead of us. And I hope to meet you and to work with you on the way forward. And with this, I would like to ask my fellow chair, Gemma, if she has wants something to add to this.
Thank you, Guus, for a wonderful introduction. I hope you will all enjoy this conference, which is, as Guus pointed out, crisis adaptation in itself. I hope we will look back by the end of the week at it as a successful meeting, rich in content, giving us many ideas. And I myself was very pleased to see the lineup of sessions that we have on very interesting topics. So I'm looking forward to be with you in different sessions this week, hopefully also around it and outside it. And with that, I hand over the stick to the chair of our keynote session. Thanks all for being here and looking forward to those 3 days.
Thanks very much, Gemma and Guus. It's for getting us started. My name is Richard Sliuzas. I'm Professor of Urban Planning for Disaster Risk Reduction at the faculty ITC in the Netherlands of the University of Twente. And it's a great pleasure for me to be chairing this opening plenary session. We have two great keynote speakers, I think, lined up. The basic program is we will start with Dr. Shuaib Lwasa. I will introduce both of them briefly beforehand, but just about the basic schedule. We will have a keynote presentation. There'll be a short opportunity for clarifying questions. Then we'll have the second keynote, again, some more questions, and then we'll have a more open discussion before concluding the session at about 15:30. So right, Shuaib Lwasa is a colleague and a good friend, I would say. He's principal researcher on governance at the Global Centre on Adaptation in Groningen in the Netherlands. But he hails from Makerere, from Uganda, and was formerly Professor of Urban Sustainability at Makerere University. He's been working in many interdisciplinary research projects, mostly in African cities, but also in South Asia. And he's been publishing on issues related to urban mitigation and adaptation to climate change, general urban environmental management, spatial planning, disaster risk reduction, and urban sustainability. He's also very much involved in IPCC work, being coordinating lead author of the Working Group 3, Chapter 8 on urban systems and human settlements, and lead author of the special report on land and climate change. So eminently qualified to address us today about issues related to urban land issues and their relation to climate risk. So Shuaib, with that, I will hand you the floor.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here to give this speech to the Lively Network, as we've been told. And I thank the organizers for the invitation to share my few cents about a lot of things that I've encountered circumventing or centered around land and connected to the various crises that are faced by cities or urban systems in Africa. And I'll focus my presentation on climate change, as mentioned by Richard, being involved in IPCC. So I'm going to be giving some background in this talk about the complexity of land, tenure and land management in several African cities. It's common, but I'm bouncing on the work that I have done in Kampala, and also connected to the convergence of crisis, particularly the issue of climate-induced crisis. And again, I'll use the example of Kampala, where we've done a lot of work together with Richard and many others around integrated disaster risk reduction, and then try to link that with the interest in land and the multi-valuation systems, and then skim over what kind of policy responses that we have seen and what kind of possible outcomes in this intersection or interacting crisis of land in itself, but also climate-induced impacts. So to just summarize a little bit about the land tenure complexity in Africa, is in many countries, including Uganda in Africa, land policies are very much incoherent, and the various were intended historically for different reasons, but they maintained directly related to the traditional land systems, or even beyond that, socio-cultural and ecological systems, because of the variety of different livelihood systems that you see in Africa. And that has come down as part of a legacy in the current urbanization in Africa, where public land management policies have more shortcomings, not only because of that interwoven nature of public land policies and transition systems, but also a lot of other issues around governance and politics. As an example, in the case of Uganda, it is on record that there are lots of disputes around land rights, and 4 out of 5 court cases, at least as per 2017, in courts of law in Uganda were very much land related, most of which around individual, group, family rights over land, but also in many cases the competition over rights with public interests in courts, so which is very much represented by public entities like municipalities or agencies that govern different aspects of the city or the country. With these linkages between land, tenure, the management of land itself on one hand, and the climate impacts, we delved a little bit into the crisis in Kampala, and we're looking at how to reduce the risk to climate-induced impacts, for example, from flash floods. And that's where we moved from hydrological flood modeling to much more nuanced understanding of social issues, economic issues and challenges around land within the city that bring the discussion between communities and different land actors with municipalities. So in a nutshell, this crisis is manifest in form of a failure of public institutions to properly manage urban land because of the multiple land management as well as conveyance and overlapping rights. You can go deep into those aspects, but for the purpose of this speech today, we can say that the different public policies, some of which are actually contradictory to each other, have enabled or inhibited conveyance of land to enable people to access, but they have also promoted overlapping rights. And around that, you have also the politics and the power which is associated with the appropriation of land rights in many cases in our cities. And the land markets, which would be non-physical but a medium through which these rights can be exchanged, is a very crucial element of urban land management. Crucial because it intercepts the process of addressing the challenges of the many crises, including climate change-induced impacts, as the case in Kampala. And one aspect of that land market that is very common, not only in cities, but across, is the commodification of land, which, as I said, promotes overlapping interests as well as the contested policies of resettlement, relocation that are very much associated with many of the public projects, like, say, infrastructure. And these contestations about the rights are illustrated by the public interest, and at this point we can put it in quotes, private interest, which could be individual, could be company, or could be group, like a family, as well as the issues that intersect, like authority and power, which is derived from laws and regulations about land, for often what we have seen as selective protection and guaranteeing of these rights. So it can go to any point. So if there is a little bit of a wielding of power by a particular entity or an individual group of people, it could end up as a selective guaranteeing or protection of rights of one entity or group or actor, and to the disenfranchisement of the others. And in a nutshell, that is the crisis on land that we are facing, which continuously interacts with climate change. So the issue of multiple interests in land, which is very much connected to the conveyance and land market system, where you have multiple valuation systems for land, as I'll be showing later, then interacting with climate-induced impacts always facilitates and perpetuates high risk for different actors, as we shall see from the example. What is interesting is that when it comes to policy response, the policy responses, of course, from the public sector often point towards resettlement, which could end up as involuntary processes of resettlement or eviction. But from the community point of view and household level landowners, it could also be voluntary relocation, which again goes back to the land market, where the land market has sometimes settled these individual rights as well as the value associated with these different rights that enables the change in use as a result of the exchange of that land. As mentioned about the crisis, I just want to use this slide and figure to skim over the kind of picture, which is not definitely the whole picture of climate impacts in Africa. This comes from the special report on 1.5 degree impact of IPCC, and partly also from the special report on land and climate change, most recent special reports from IPCC, all of which have indicated the increasing likelihood of impacts of climate change on multiple systems in Africa, and cities being one of them. And some of the impacts are direct to cities. Some of the impacts are very much associated with areas that feed into the cities, for example, rural areas. So extreme weather events like monsoons and precipitation, drought, and heat waves. Africa is also starting to experience heat waves, if not already, as well as impact on water availability. So some cities are very much drenched with water. Others actually have very little water, or sometimes even no water at all at some point, as we are reminded by the discourse around the run-up to day zero, which never came to actually day zero, but that was indicative of what the possibilities are. And in between here, there is a small map of Africa, reduced one, which shows some of the cities in Africa of 2 million people and above. But we should not forget about the secondary cities of 25,000 up to 400,000, which are the majority of the cities or urban systems that are very important to look at in terms of resilience building, connecting all the cities as well as with the rural areas. So in summary, what is happening in the interaction of the land crisis on one part and climate change impacts is that we have on the top left here one of the scenarios, the SSP 8.6, of course, that is in the future, but we're starting to experience heat and increasing temperatures, which manifests in observed key weather conditions that monitored temperature, precipitation, and the like in the country Uganda, that indicates a statistical change, and that translates, at least from observed data, into anomalies. So the graphs you see in the center here show anomalies in terms of temperature here, as well as anomalies in terms of precipitation. And for the bars that are pointing down on this graph, it indicates that almost all, in all seasons, there is a registration of anomalies in precipitation, just like it is with temperatures. So we have over and above temperatures, and sometimes also over and above precipitation, or much less precipitation. And what has happened with these anomalies, what is happening as an impact is it's intersecting with the growth of the city. This is a model of futuristic growth of Kampala, and this is what the situation is, at least by 2012. And this is how Kampala is developing. So you can see a little bit of, get a sense of how the city is growing. And if you, this picture is clear with the background of blue, you will notice that there's dense, built up parts of the city in the lower to in middle slopes of the hills, because Kampala is formed of hills. And such impact is translated when you have extreme weather events into flash floods. The pictures on the top, the left, the lower left corner, in one of the summits where we have done research. And this is the evidence of some of the activities, or rather the responses of these impacts to the communities there. So this is, for me, a very interesting slide and picture that shows how climate impacts are interacting with the land crisis in the city to exacerbate vulnerabilities to flash floods in the case of Kampala City. The implication of this interaction is that when, on one hand, the land market and land management policies are inhibiting efficient, affordable, and accessible land, both to households but also public agencies, in order to install and build urban infrastructure. And for the municipalities, the hazards such as flash floods or landslides are a very good justification for the kind of policies like resettlement or relocation, or even involuntary evictions, what we have also seen in some situations happening not only in Kampala but other places. But there is a problem, and the problem is that there is a disjuncture between the public and private interests in land when it comes to managing urban infrastructure, when it comes to building resilience through installation of infrastructure by the public entities, because of the contestations around who's right, or how is it valued, and who is going to be compensated, and how much would that compensation be, and who has it, and where you have the complexity of land tenure characterized by group interest in the same piece of land, you get into really serious challenges there. So the interests, the rights, and the valuation are very important, because land is immobile, and therefore what we look at mostly is the rights, and those rights could be, I've talked a lot about land market, but those rights could come in as a result of various processes, not just the market, as we shall see. And those rights could also be recognized, rights could also be unrecognized, but they are largely entitlements for benefits from that piece, from a piece of land or multiple pieces of land. And as a result, there are multiple layers of interest, often on the same piece of land, which affect how the policies and the response options to climate crisis are actually designed, whether it is at household level, community level, or even municipal level, or even at national level. This is an illustration of what happens. The lower part of the picture, which is red, is a parcel, two-dimensional piece of land on which could have a freehold title to somebody or an entity, but then at the same time also there could be somebody who has some use rights. Those rights could have been derived either through transfer or taking care or gifts or bequeathing, and then over that, there could also be a house which is owned by completely somebody else. It's a rare case, but on a few occasions that has happened, which is very much also partly influenced by I'm losing control, by the informal, something is happening with the presentation, the informal mode of exchange to land. And then what is happening is that because of the rights, excuse me, somebody is controlling the presentation. I'm not in control anymore.
Could you, I don't know what's going on, but it looks like someone else is controlling it.
Yeah, it looks like somebody else is controlling.
If you're not speaking, please leave the controls alone. Sorry, Shuaib.
No problem. Well, thanks. So the issue here is the exchangeable rights, the time and location, as well as the rules of the game, are the ones that very much influence how land is valued, and the multiple perspectives of this valuation of land that is illustrated in this simple graphic, but very important in terms of resilience building or managing crisis. On the top left here are three axes or dimensions of cost, risk, and value. And this, if we could place it in the context of a crisis like, say, flash floods or heat wave of drought, and then you have three categories of actors on land: the households, the landowner, you can add another category, community, whatever, and the local government. It's very clear that the way, and this is coming out of the research that we did, the most important dimension of a land by these three categories: for the household, it is the cost; for the landowner, it is the value, which is the marketable value, whereas for the local government or municipality, it's the risk. And these three perspectives will definitely lead to a contradiction in the kind of policy options that are deployed to manage the risk and build resilience. Why? Because for the household, it's about asset accumulation. For the public entities, it's about asset building, so you can talk of infrastructure, drainage, and the like, and the roads. Whereas for the landowners, it is maximizing the economic value. These contradictions are very important in understanding why land matters in managing risk, particularly climate, and building resilience. And an example of, again, coming from the research that we did that is illustrated here is that on the left here, the policy responses on the left, if it is individual or household, it could be toleration of risk, which is partly why we see a lot of communities, in the case of Kampala, Bwaise, Natete, and the like, they continuously stay in flood-prone areas because they tolerate that risk. But when it reaches a tipping point, they can voluntarily relocate as an option. Sometimes that relocation is temporal, and it doesn't have to be very far. It could be just a few, 1,000 or 100 meters from the particular site. What is important is that emerged from the research that we conducted is that the risk itself is there, but there are other important aspects that determine what kind of response option at household or family or community level should be done. And that is access to employment, access to education, health services, and even social ties with the people. And this is given here in the detail of the text, which is very small. I'm sorry about that. But I think this is a good representation. And then on the other end of the scale, you have the municipality or the public entity, whose valuation is mostly risk, and therefore the policy response would be, how do we increase the capacities of the drainage systems? How do we build the roads? And that would mean that a good number of people affected by that expansion or installing of infrastructure would be involuntarily resettled or even relocated. So the crisis, the climate crisis on the right-hand side here could be an example that triggers the policy option. And when it triggers that, the outcomes, depending on whether it's individual or public entity, could be voluntary or involuntary relocation. Sometimes it could also be settled by the market, as some examples have come through in the case of a small, not a small, but one of the neighborhood that we studied in Natete, because it's partly semi-industrial zone. These medium-scale industries are actually buying out the residents because they can afford the land improvements to tolerate the risk of flood of their manufacturing yards or even factories. So the scenarios are illustrated in this slide, where you have an intervention option for risk reduction. And on one scale is the household, it's about asset accumulation. Often when the disaster occurs, it's asset loss and damage. And on the other scale is the city or regional government, which is about asset building. Again, it could be asset loss, but also the cost, the increasing costs, and then the gaps having to always running a catch-up in order to fill the gap of the infrastructure deficit in the cities is a very important driver also for these kind of policies. The benefits for all could be reduction of risk, could be savings, but could also be avoided risk. But you can see that the costs are much more in number, but those could also translate in terms of monetary value of that cost, whether it is creating new risk, it could also be a continuation of risk, it could be indirect costs, it could also be defensive application and cost of residual damage. And these costs are associated with both adaptation and in some situations also mitigation of climate change. So again, bouncing back to the example of the communities, this is the representation of the city, part of the city region that we are working in, and the two settlements where we work here on this map, this light blue here and that green one, with the elevation model that shows the drainage system. What is important, without going into detail of the actual surveys and the results of the surveys, but to summarize that, is that multiple factors come together for households and communities to rate and value risk, as well as cost and value to land. And this is very different because of proximity to employment, because of access to health, education, as well as social ties. These are much more important than actually a flash flood which will clear in 2 or 3 days, or multiple flash floods in the rain season that will clear maybe in a week or 2. And we're seeing the increasing in terms of depths of even these the flash floods. And when it comes to resilience building in these communities, we have noted that the resilience building needs to rest on the local as well as the cultural realms. And you can discuss and debate about the cultural realms in cities, but there's need to rethink resilience not to be a universal order, but resilience that is contextualized and encapsulated around the cultural and socio-economic as well as demographic issues of a particular settlement. So to give you an example here that is much more detailed, a lot of households that we talked to, and the surveys also brought this result out, said that they can tolerate the flash floods as long as they have places where they can, for example, temporarily relocate and then come back, because of the importance they attach to access to education for their children. So you can see the tolerable level of risk in these cities. And therefore, if you're going to do resilience building, there is need to address these issues and consider them in that local and cultural specific realm. And when it comes to resettlement and relocation, from this study, we think that that should be the last option, or they should be the last options. All other options of land improvement, critical infrastructure, but with minimal destruction as well as eviction, those are the kind of options that need to be taken into account before resettlement and relocation becomes unavoidable. And that speaks a lot to justice when it comes to land management in cities, because it's very important. These people have a right to stay in the city, just like all others. And by the way, this is not to emphasize that the impacts and the risk is only felt by communities in flood-prone areas. It's also communities that are not in flood-prone areas. And then to quickly go over the IPC special report on land, in the special report on land, urban land management is mentioned. It's one of the options because land is under growing human pressure and it's a part of solution to climate change, but it is not the only solution. And these pictures that may not be very clear to you show you by this color coding of green, which is high benefits of adaptation and mitigation, and orange, which is no mitigation, show you the different interventions, even in urban land management, that can be applied in order to reduce the impact of climate change. And that report is accessible, it's downloadable, you can read it. In conclusion, I would like to say that there has been a lot of talk about building better, rather building back better. It's one of the catchphrases also for one of the big economies in the world. But we think that from this research, that building better is important before you build back better, because building better means harnessing the opportunities that are not foreseen when the policy response is about relocation or resettlement, especially around infrastructure in cities and housing and other important key infrastructure pieces. Then when it comes to land, it is very much a local and cultural issue in many African cities, as mentioned earlier. These are undetachable, and it's very important that these are contextualized in any kind of design of policy to build resilience and address climate impacts. The evaluation also needs to transcend the cost-benefit analysis, which is translates into a number that informs a decision that this piece of infrastructure with this strength and size is what is going to make this community resilient. But what about the social aspects? What about the education? What about the employment? So the evaluation system, and we offer a relatively less tested but perhaps important framework for valuation system analysis that has come out in one of our new book on rethinking risk assessment and valuation. It's very recent, actually, 2 weeks ago, that it was released by Cambridge Press. And then we also need to debunk existing regulatory and policy systems for inclusive resilience building. The current policy systems are not inclusive enough because the perspective is largely around risk and does not take into consideration the perspective of value for the landowners, nor even the cost of maintaining and living. And I just want to end with a quick note with these pictures you see on the left, that Africa is a very interesting continent. It's a large landmass, but it is not one landmass, neither is it one country, and neither are the cities the same. They are very unique, and therefore, whatever resilience building or future you think about Africa, it will have to be very much contextualized. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Good, thank you very much, Shuaib. Interesting presentation, which covering many different issues. I would like to just point out we have an opportunity now to ask for some clarifying questions. I see that Mark Wekerif has posted a question already, but which seems to me to be a little bit broader than just a clarifying question. So if you don't mind, Mark, I would maybe postpone the response to that question till we finish both of the keynotes. I have myself one clarifying question. Maybe other people need a bit of time to think and write something. You can use the chat to do that. We can also give you access to the microphone if you prefer. Shuaib, in your presentation, you were talking about perspectives of risk, cost, and value, and looking at differences between households and local governments, for example. But I was a little puzzled, but what your notion of risk was there when specifically for the local government. Are you referring particularly sort of to disaster risk, or sort of a general perspective on damage and loss, whether it's public or private, or specifically for risks maybe that or potential losses that the local government itself faces?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, the notion of risk here is the risk that is associated with disasters in the cities. And that also includes the loss and damage to the assets that are built by the city. So the concerns have always been, if there is extreme weather events, what is the risk to our roads, the drainage, and it's also the risk to the communities and housing. So from that perspective, the cities are very much informed by the disaster and the hazard. And unless by, of course, in the context of trying to protect their assets, but also protect communities. So that is what I meant. So risk here is it should be qualified disaster risk. Yeah.
Okay, I see someone else is typing. Maybe because we have a little bit of time still, you could perhaps deal with the question that Mark posed and just read it out. How do we create a right to the city for people who don't have the money to buy the space? This is essential for inclusive cities. There is the right to space for economic activity, the right to trade, as well as a right of a place to live.
I wish I had the answer, Mark, for you. It's been a very intricate and persistent problem of the right to the city. And especially when it comes to the materialization of cities and control by different groups, it becomes very difficult. Even the voices of protecting everybody's right to the city and protecting land, putting some land off the market, preserving areas for particular types of economic activities, whether it is on the road verges, whether it's on the road islands or on the side roads. These questions are still lingering, and I wish I had an answer to do that. But one important point I would like to say is that we cannot continue to think that the market, in whatever form, is the solution to the city problems that you have mentioned. there has to be some form of protection and guarantee. And it goes back to the point I mentioned about the public entities and the rules and regulations often selectively protecting and guaranteeing some people's rights and not others. And this is a very classic example where the regulations would guarantee me as an individual to own a large piece of land at the expense of thousands of households who may not have where to trade from or even live. So we have seen many examples of markets, and we have seen many examples of people being chased off the streets because they're trading, because they're misusing the space. It's that kind of protection that is needed for them to do that. And it requires rethinking the planning and the policies in cities. The way that cities in Africa have developed is testimony to a requirement of different ways, modus operandi of planning and developing cities to allow what we think of as informal to be one of the key sectors in the economy. So I wish I really had a very straight answer for you, Mark.
Good, thanks. We may be able to come back to this later as well. There's just one maybe final clarifying question, and then someone is also asking for links to your publications. I'm sure we can make those available later. Yeah. Either in the presentation or in some manner via the conference website. Yeah. The final question, maybe for clarification, is in the examples that you've seen in your research, Shuaib, have you seen any sort of examples where governments do or have been able to take into account the perspectives of owners and users in a more, say, inclusive manner?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are some examples, but very few examples. And what is important in those examples is that there's always a champion in government, or at whatever level, whether it's local government or even national government, who takes it by him or herself to champion the cause of inclusiveness in this protection of land rights as well as resilience building. So we do have them. In the case of Kampala, there are a couple of communities that have been protected, re-evaluation for the expansion of one of the drainage systems of Natete that has lingered on, and because of the champions in the government, the re-evaluation is being done, and it's expected that a much more meaningful type of compensation will be done that would allow them to get land elsewhere, what is almost the same value as where they were living. Yeah.
Very good. I think we're going to leave this part of the clarifying questions here, but Shuaib will come back for the final discussion, which can be a bit more open after the next keynote has made her presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce her to you. There's Dr. Wytske Chamberlain, who works for the Land Matrix, which is hosted by the University of Pretoria. So also an African perspective, but from a different country and over a different issue. Dr. Chamberlain has worked for more than 10 years on issues related to large-scale land acquisitions across Africa, and has developed many deep insights into these processes. She specialized in the field of inclusive business models, in particular in agricultural sector. She's done a lot of research on different complex and compound structures that enable the integration of smallholder farmers and poor rural communities into commercial value chains in South Africa. She is broadly interested in land governance, in other words. So, Dr. Chamberlain, could I invite you to give your keynote, and then we will follow that with another round of short clarifying questions and then a more open Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. I hope you can all hear me. And yeah, good morning, good evening, wherever you are across the world. Thank you for joining this year's LANDac conference, and in particular, this keynote. What I will do in my presentation over the next few 20 minutes or so is I want to look at large-scale land acquisitions, looking back at a decade of the global land rush, and drawing lessons from that to create resilient context for large-scale land acquisitions, to make sure that these large-scale land acquisitions become more inclusive, responsible, and sustainable for the communities in which they take place. So, talking about the convergence of crises. About 10 years ago, 3 crises happened at the same time. There was a financial crisis with share prices plummeting. There was a food crisis with the prices of basic food staple crops increasing. And there was a fuel crisis. Oil prices were rising, and at the same time, the climate crisis also became very prevalent, which led to many countries implementing biofuel policies. So these 3 crises sparked an interest in land and agriculture in developing countries. Land was seen as abundant. Agriculture was regarded as a safe investment in light of the ever-growing world population. Now, the land matrix has engaged in a decade of intensive data collection, and this allows us to evaluate these investments and the impacts that they have. Now, first, I want to show you a few data. What we see here is that indeed, from about 2008 onwards, the land grabbing, so to say, started to, hang on, I see that I am on one slide too far. We see here that this boom in land acquisitions actually started to happen from about the year 2007, 2008 onwards. More recently, we see that this development has leveled off a bit. Looking at August 2020, we have reported about 1,500 deals that have been concluded. And these deals cover an area of about 30 million hectares. Now, that is similar to the size of Italy or the Philippines. The reasons that we see a leveling off in more recent years are multiple. Global markets have stabilized. Oil and food prices have fallen. Stock markets have equally recovered. But also policy changes have had a downwards effect. For example, adjusting the biofuel targets downwards. Moratoria on land acquisitions have been implemented, and countries have also looked at setting targets on implementation. An example is Karuturi. It's an Indian investor in Ethiopia that started with an allocation of about 300,000 hectares. Now, very quickly already, the Ethiopian government decided that this was a bit too much, and they adjusted that downwards to 100,000 hectares. But the company struggled to start operations. And as a result, the Ethiopian government reduced the company's area to only 1,200 hectares. Now, the company objected, and after a prolonged legal battle, Karuturi now has rights to about 15,000 hectares. That's a fraction of the initial 100,000, let alone the 300,000 that they intended. So we see that multiple factors have caused a leveling off of the touching of land. What we also see is that the operations are lagging behind. Implementation is not coming off the ground as expected, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. The implementation rate in Eastern Europe and Latin America is much higher. One of the factors that we have identified here is that there are high setup and transaction costs, and it means that investors acquire more land than what they initially need, simply to make sure that they can increase their size later on. Now, an illustration of how these setup and transaction costs impact on investors is a grain farm in Zimbabwe. They suffered from unreliable power and water supply, and that hindered the expansion of their farming areas. In other cases, we see that poor soils mean that areas are unsuitable for production. Investors also set aside land for conservation purposes. If you look at Olam in Gabon, they have established palm oil activities, but as part of their whole concession area, they need to set aside large areas for this conservation to make sure that the tropical forests in which they operate remain. We see that management mistakes and misguided expectations, the realities on the ground, all contribute to investments that do not materialize or only at a very slow pace. We see a general pattern that larger projects and biofuel investments are more likely to fail. Also, projects that target land formerly used by smallholders or pastoralists are more likely to fail. And this is probably because the resources that are required to prepare these lands for commercial production are more higher. Projects that involve a domestic partner or that take place in countries with better developed infrastructure are less likely to fail. But failed and abandoned projects, as well as deals that are slow to materialize, do have a permanent effect on the host community, partly because the land has been lost to them. They no longer have access to those lands, but also due to conflicts that leave a permanent scar on the communities. And examples of this abound in countries like Senegal, but also Madagascar and many other countries. Now, and that has a lot to do with the tenure security. And this tenure security is the first, the first aspect that to highlight when it comes to building a resilient context for large-scale land acquisitions. We observe that investments take place in all countries, regardless of their tenure system. But the local context certainly has an impact. For example, in Kenya, land acquisitions are much smaller in size, and they are aimed at more intensive production models in areas that have private titles compared to areas with weaker land tenure security. Now, in general, investors target relatively well-connected and populated rural areas and land that is used by smallholders or pastoralists. So there is no such thing as idle land. But regardless of the tenure security in the locality, it is clear that large-scale land acquisitions put pressure on land. And in particular, people in areas with weak land tenure systems feel the consequences of large-scale land acquisitions, displacements, and loss in livelihoods. Now, consultation processes often do not take place, and compensation for loss of land is also inadequate. For example, in Laos, land loss was reported for 152 villages, but only 52 of these received some form of monetary compensation. So what we see is that these investments put external pressure on common pool resources. Now, these common pool resources have successfully been managed by self-governing institutions for years, but the external pressures from LSLAs, large-scale land acquisitions, threaten the security of the users of these common properties. And in particularly, the monetary incentives that are now put on these resources pose challenges in the form of power abuse, internal conflicts, and also corruption. And that is even more profound where the land governance systems are weak. Now, it results in unequal outcomes, with those in power potentially benefiting from investments, but the more vulnerable segments of the community losing out. So what can we learn from the development so far? First of all, policy change is required. Now, governments across the developing world have already implemented policy changes to address the negative impacts of large-scale land acquisitions. For example, Malawi enacted a land reform law that allows customary land to be registered. Land moratoria have been implemented in Liberia, Ukraine, Cambodia, and other countries. But aside from these individual countries, global frameworks have been drawn up. Think of the VGGTs and the RAI. And these give practical guidance to governments, communities, and private investors. And indeed, we've seen that these frameworks have formed the basis for the framework and guidelines on land policy in Africa that have been drawn up by the African Union. And ASEAN has also used these in formulating their guidelines on land. A second tool that mitigates the risk and builds more resilience is multi-stakeholder platforms. This is a tool where different actors identify policy issues, but also assure that governments comply with policy relating to land management and investment. And an inclusive institution can defend broader social and public interests, push for land reform and the implementation of the VGGTs. A second aspect relating to large-scale land acquisitions are the socio-economic development. Large-scale agriculture investment is often hailed to bring jobs, livelihood opportunities, and other benefits to the host community. Now, I've already touched upon the often inadequate compensation for communities losing access to their resources. It turns out that spin-off effects can also be disappointing. The foreign investors grow low labor-intensive crops such as grains, and the production model that they implement is highly mechanized. So what we see is that the labor intensity is lower than that of the smallholder activities they replace. Some crops show significant job opportunities. For example, a coffee farm in Uganda employs over 3,000 workers during harvest time. Flower farming is equally labor intensive, and even oil palm plantations offer a substantial number of jobs. But the limited employment generation is not the only thing. The labor markets in the target countries are often precarious. Contracts are often of a temporary nature. Workers are underpaid and work in detrimental conditions. But positive examples do exist. The horticulture sector in Kenya, vast majority of workers there have a contract and permanent employment. And in Mozambique, a soy corridor shows that wages are indeed much higher than alternative jobs. So studies suggest also that the temporary jobs that do materialize tend to benefit the most vulnerable segments of the population. Now, a second spillover is on local smallholder farmers. This can occur in different ways. On the one side, smallholders can increase their productivity through access to better seeds, inputs, technology, and knowledge. And we indeed see that smallholder farmers in Zambia, for example, have demonstrated a 20% increase in their maize yields in areas where large-scale farms are established. Tea farmers in Malawi that are in close proximity to a tea estate also demonstrate a higher productivity than smallholders further away. Large farms can also offer a market for smallholders through contracting arrangements. For example, oil palm producers in Indonesia have included thousands of small-scale growers into their value chain. Now, this is partly triggered by a legally defined boundary that these investors need to set aside at least 20% of their concession area for contract farming. Despite these contract farming arrangements, it's not always clear whether they are beneficial or whether they're detrimental to the smallholders. Some smallholders are indeed able to increase their livelihoods and gain economic benefits. Other smallholders end up in cycles of death. Smallholder farmers also experience negative effects from competition for scarce water and labor resources. We see, for example, in Sierra Leone, smallholder farmers close to a sugar plantation saw their incomes drop by about 10% because they had to pay much higher wages for seasonal workers. Other benefits to the communities relate to health, education facilities, and infrastructure, but this is not a priority for investors. Rather, many investors choose a location in well-connected and populated areas where they don't have to bear the cost of developing their own infrastructure. And a last remark relating to socio-economic development is on food security. Now, we see that a lot of investors actually opt to grow crops for export or for fuel, certainly at the beginning of the land rush. More recently, we've also seen that numerous projects have changed their crops to include food for the local market. And this was partly informed by economic reasons, with world market prices changing, but conflicts with communities are equally important. And investors have started to realize that they have to play a role as good citizens within the community where they operate. So overall, when we look at the socio-economic factors, we see that there certainly are pockets of poverty reduction through large-scale land acquisitions. But it is very much a case of a coin with two sides. Some community members benefit, others experience more negative impacts. So the possible increase of inequality of large-scale land acquisitions should certainly not be overlooked. What can we do to mitigate the risks related to socio-economic development? First of all, we need to make sure that local development and smallholder inclusion is put at the center stage. And this goes right from the initial phases of an investment through consultation and all the way through into implementation. Free, prior, and informed consent is an absolute minimum. Many examples exist, for example, where investors incorrectly assume that communities agree with their plans simply because national government officials or traditional leaders agree. And overall, investors need to adhere to these international guidelines, such as the RAI and the VGGTs that I have already mentioned. There's also a role for host governments, though. Often they have applied a one-size-fits-all approach. They prioritize investments into large-scale family as their model for development. But it has become clear a more diversified approach is needed. The question needs to be answered, what type of investment is needed? And in addition, investment incentives that are offered should prioritize smallholders rather than the current practice of offering tax breaks. Now, to draw up a holistic strategy, a range of actors, such as the private sector, civil society, farmer organization, even the legal fraternity, need to be involved in policy decisions. And the multi-stakeholder platform mentioned earlier are an avenue to achieve this inclusive decision-making. Furthermore, large-scale land acquisitions are a global phenomenon. Stakeholders from multiple countries, integration into global value chains. Now, changes in international regulatory frameworks can contribute to the required change in business conduct to respect human rights and the environment. Now, one instrument to achieve this are investment treaties that govern land and international investment. And these treaties often do very little to strengthen host communities and countries at the moment. For example, in ASEAN's investment treaty, land is specifically excluded from the application of the treaty's protection of expropriation. Now, a decade of land rush has highlighted the importance of including the human rights aspect into international investment treaties, with the onus not just on governments, but also on the investors. Environmental and social sustainability of the production in global value chains is increasingly being questioned, and we see that everywhere. Now, this has resulted in private sustainability standards, such as the RSPO for palm oil, but also responsible soy. We see that the European Union and the US are discussing mandatory due diligence standards to further drive responsible investment. And lastly, financing partners such as banks and DFIs have the responsibility to request the firms that they invest in to sign up and adhere to responsible business practices. And that brings me to the next aspect of a resilient context for large-scale land acquisition, namely, that went a bit too quick. Hang on. Where is my presentation gone? Sorry, I just lost my presentation there for a moment. Environmental aspects. Large-scale agriculture investment causes land conversion from natural habitats, and that is associated with massive losses of biodiversity. Geographic mapping of investments in the land matrix shows that there's a large overlap with these investments on biodiversity hotspots. LSLA-related agricultural expansion has been demonstrated as a major cause of deforestation in tropical areas, particularly the production of beef, soy, oil palm, and wood have high rates of deforestation. We look at Brazil, deforestation accelerated under Bolsonaro for soy production and cattle ranching. In Indonesia, palm oil expansion continues. And in other Southeast Asian countries, large area of rubber plantation replaced tropical forests. In Africa, deforestation has not yet taken place at a similar scale, but the threat is considerable. Large areas have been transferred to investors, but these investments have not yet been implemented. The remaining forests are increasingly fragmented and are unable to support the rich biodiversity of these habitats. Furthermore, large-scale land acquisitions have a detrimental effect on water resources. The crops produced by large-scale agricultural operations tend to be water-intense. And furthermore, water pollution and erosion pose threats to the environment and the communities around the investment. Analysis confirms that large-scale land acquisitions place a considerable pressure on already water-stressed area. So the overall impact of large-scale land acquisitions on the environment, and in particular deforestation and biodiversity loss, becomes increasingly important in the face of the current COVID crisis. So to mitigate these risks, we have to make sure that areas that have not yet been deforested remain in the way they are. The international community has already committed to combat biodiversity loss and climate change under the SDGs. To achieve these targets, developed countries need to assist developing countries in halting large-scale land acquisition that leads to deforestation. The already mentioned investment treaties can assist in this, and climate funding can also contribute to enable host countries to implement measures against deforestation. Host countries should also develop comprehensive landscape plans that address environmental, economic, and social objectives. And these plans, these holistic plans that must be publicly available, should define the role of LSLAs in those plans. Once again, the multi-stakeholder platforms can contribute to these plans. Environmental impact assessments, disease risk and health impact assessments should also be a requirement for investors. Overall, these similar environmental community assessments should also be considered when land is acquired for climate projects, for example, solar, wind farms, and afforestation. I want to leave you, I have one more little message for you that I want to round off with. I want to leave you with these thoughts. Over the last year, food prices have increased by 40%, according to the FAO. The emergence of COVID-19 underlies the importance of biodiversity and the risks associated with deforestation. The resulting crisis has been used by governments to push through policies under the banner of economic recovery. The signs are there that a new rush of land is in the making. So it becomes increasingly urgent to create a resilient context for more equitable, fair, and sustainable investments in agriculture. All stakeholders have a role to play. Many lessons have been learned over the past decades. Many initiatives have been implemented. So the tools are there to protect the communities, and in particular, the more vulnerable segments. I think we are now more prepared to mitigate the risks flowing from the expected new wave of large-scale land-based investments. And with that, I would like to thank you.
Got a few clarifying questions for you on the chat. So maybe we can move straight into them, and I'll start at the top. I think the first one was Justine Sylvester. To what extent are local governments still promoting the myth of idle land? And could you share your views on the way donors, IFIs, the development community has played in promoting this myth, and perhaps also the private sector itself?
Okay. Yeah, the myth of idle land is something that really took hold about 10, 12 years ago, when the rush for land really started. The experiences over the last few years have basically meant that this myth no longer exists, and most of the stakeholders no longer adhere to this. Having said that, there are still certain governments, actors that do believe that particular areas of land are underused and should be used better, not necessarily as idle, but rather seen as underproductive. So I think there's a slight change in how this is phrased. Idle land, we know does not exist anymore, but it's now rather phrased as underproductive land.
Okay, thank you. I see Mark Wecker has posed actually two questions. I'll sort of try to combine them a little bit, because the first one is sort of saying about the most, you seem to have said that the most vulnerable are the ones who benefit when jobs materialize. But he also later was referring to some comments, I think, that you made about the flower industry in Kenya as having positive effects on employment. But he's sort of wondering what the quality of the jobs are like, and also there may be some downsides in terms of health issues, particularly related to pesticide use in the flower industry, which is quite endemic, I think. So yeah, jobs and environmental quality, health issues. How do you see these things panning out?
Yeah, it's very much an investor dependent, project dependent outcome. What I want to highlight is that there are a lot of disputable investments where indeed the poor labor market regulations allow for situations where, for example, health and safety issues are not adhered to, where minimum wages are not being paid. So yes, that is definitely visible in many investments. However, we also want to point out that that doesn't happen in every single investment, and that's why I wanted to show the case of Kenya in particular, where there are pockets where investors do look after their employees and make sure that they adhere to minimum standards and create a better environment for them to work. Not everywhere, but there certainly are parts.
Just sort of building on that point a little bit. I know, especially in the Kenyan situation, there's quite a lot of Dutch investors are involved in flower growing in the Lake Naivasha area, for example. To what extent would be foreign NGOs exerting pressure on their, the Dutch farming community in Kenya? Is that a force of significance in ensuring better health and working conditions?
I think that particular pressure from civil society in the more developed countries where a lot of these products end up certainly start to play a role. Maybe not necessarily in the relatively small horticulture and floricultural segments, but more in those investors that have a lot of visibility. of course, we all know about Shell and their the pressure from shareholders there to change their businesses to their business model. Similar example is in America, where a large organization, it's the Harvard University, has been linked to land grabbing and unsustainable business practices in Latin America, and there's a lot of pressure on them to pull out of these kind of practices as well. So we definitely see that there is a very critical way of looking at investments from the developed world, Europe and America, and it's starting to have an impact on how these investors behave in the global south. Absolutely.
I'll just bring in the next question from Guus, and then I'll try to open up the discussion a little bit and bring Shuaib in using a question from Ian Plecker. But Guus was asking about also about this the jobs that are created by plantation type investments. How do you see the level of livelihoods that are attainable via such jobs as compared to independent smallholders, which are arguably the alternative for many?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's exactly the point. The alternative. What is the alternative? So, in those situations, those areas where there are very, very few alternative opportunities, these jobs do offer an opportunity for community members to alternative livelihoods. In a way, something is better than nothing. In other areas where alternative livelihoods are more available through, for example, their own smallholder farming, plantation jobs seem to not bring as many advantages of farming by yourself. However, once again, there is a large segment of the population does not have access to land. So small is not an option for them, and especially the more vulnerable segments of the community, being migrant workers or women, do tend to at least get access to some form of livelihood. Whether it's a sustainable livelihood or not is to be discussed. So there are pros and there are cons to the same model.
Good, thanks. I'll just move on with the question of Ian Plecker, and then I'll try to bring in Shuaib, as I said, because Ian was asking, do you have some special general insights on the impact of large-scale land acquisitions on urban areas rather than on rural areas? And maybe Shuaib can think about that as well. For example, urban informal settlements, when reviewing the global land rush, especially given the forces of urbanization, which are really very high at present in Africa. We know that Africa has a relatively low urbanization rate at present, but it's rising rapidly, and particularly small and medium-sized cities. So your thoughts on that, perhaps, and then maybe Shuaib could also come in.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We at the Land Matrix look very much at the slightly bigger investments, so 200 hectares and up, and these seem to be slightly away from areas. Having said that, most of the investments do take place at least in some vicinity, say about 2 hours of a major settlement. So there will be a little bit of pressure, but the areas that we are looking at tend to be a little bit further away from the urban areas, and therefore we don't see as much of a pressure there. But yes, Shuaib might have different insights on that.
Okay, Shuaib.
Yeah, thanks. The straight answer to that has been forced evictions. And we have so many examples in Kampala. Even I can also refer to maybe an example in Nairobi, where the large-scale acquisitions, which are often very interesting because it's not direct. You can hardly identify the actual beneficiary for that acquisition and appropriation, but it is through agents, and the one on the front line is very different from the eventual user of the land. So, for example, we've had previously almost 15 years lingering conflict around one of the parts, a very large acquisition close to the city center that was housing a low-income, historically developed low-income settlement, to redevelop it into a satellite city. It's over 15 years, only one building ever since it was allocated to the investor. Only one building has been constructed, and the original beneficiaries and residents in this settlement have not got the compensations. They still maintain the association, but have been in the courts of law over and over again, and nothing is being resolved. It goes back to the point of protection and guaranteeing the rights. So the state, on one hand, told them that it will protect their rights, but it's the same state that transferred that land to the investor who was supposed to build a large city. In the interesting case in Nairobi, and anybody from Kenya can correct me on this, was that it is not even about land which was occupied by residents, people who are alive. It is land of the it's land that was occupied by a cemetery, and there have been contradiction around that in Langat, I think, and the transfer of the cemetery to Kitengela site, which was very interesting. And then it brought a different dynamic to the land issues in the city. So the straight answer to that question is that eviction is always the outcome. Involuntary relocation is always the outcome, but it's also associated with many issues around compensation, what value, not just because I've been talking about value and who is compensated and who is not, but who are the players behind this large acquisition? Is it the state? Is it a real investor? Is it foreign? Is it local? There are many faces, and it's really difficult to get your grip onto the right people who do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, one of the questions, my own questions which came up is the role of foreign direct investment, and I think whether or not foreign direct investment schemes are subject to the same procedures and rules as, say, smaller local investors would be. Given also that I think that we know from experience that even the legal system and the procedures associated with that are often not very necessarily effective, but they do at least provide some sort of measure of recourse to appeal or whatever. Is that something that you see in relation to these large-scale agricultural investments, that special procedures are implemented in order to circumvent sort of the normal rule of law, you could say?
Yeah, it's what you see in these kind of situations is that investors try to they align with like what we call this, like the legal systems from their own country, rather than align with host country legal systems. The host countries often have legal systems that have lots of loopholes and shortcomings, but they don't even tend to look at that. And host countries are these kind of constructions as well. So what we see is that foreign investors often have access to a different legal system than domestic investors.
Is that something that you see also in cities, Shuaib? Because I know in certainly in many African cities, you see a great drive for modernization. See a lot of capital coming in from China, from the Middle East, and other sources.
Yeah. There's a very interesting legal procedure which kind of is a shortcut. There is a clause that was inserted in the law about 2008, the land law, that if there is any dispute own a certain piece of land by multiple interest, rights, then the state takes control of that land to guarantee the protection of all the competing parties. What is interesting about that is that in the process, the process of the state taking the land is very fast. The process of resolving the conflict is very slow in the courts of law. And by the time the original owners who have even settled and even developed the land get any form of resolution in the courts of law, the FDE or the investor has already invested on that piece of land, because there is that guaranteeing of rights by the state. And usually it is settled out of the court so that there is a market-based compensation to the original landowners. So that is really very interesting and insinuating that in a way the state also is using the regulatory process to cut short the process of land for FDIs, but it also does it in a manipulative way, in the sense that the guarantee of the rights are given to the FDI agent, and very slowly the guaranteeing on protection of rights for the original owner are resolved over a long period of time.
Good, thank you very much. We're getting towards the end of this session. I know that there might be one or two questions still unanswered in the chat. I'm very sorry for that, but I think we can't really deal with them right now. Perhaps our two keynotes could still have a look in the chat and see whether you can respond, and also post again, send us an email perhaps. I see also that some people are posting links to publications and other sources, other documents, and that's great. I think it's great. It's a great way to share your expertise, even if you're not able to pose a question or join one of the discussions. I'm going to have. Sorry, I heard someone's voice. Okay, no. Well, I personally enjoyed the session very much. I'm afraid I really have to finish off because I have something very, very important, someone's examination to attend in just a couple of minutes. So that's also needs my attention. I really look forward to joining later sessions of LANDac. I hope you will as well. And I was asked to make one final announcement before rounding off this opening session. I think that we will, after this, there will be a short break of about 15 minutes, and then various parallel sessions will start. But at 17 hours, so in about 1.5 hours from now, there will be a special sort of get to know open interaction session where you can meet and greet other people who are involved in this online conference. It's a poor alternative, I think, to meeting in person and raising a glass together and having a bite and a chat and a laugh. But hopefully we can still have a chat and a laugh as well, and share our experiences and get to know one another a bit better and help build the LANDac network to make it stronger and more effective. Thank you very much. I don't know if Chantal or anyone else wants to make any closing remark. If not, thank you and see you again.
Thank you.